Russia has assumed the presidency of the United Nations Security Council. It's taking on the position while waging war in Ukraine. So what does this mean for the UN? And can it still play the role its founders hoped for in seeking world peace? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. So, Russia has taken over the presidency of the UN's most important body, the Security Council. Its ascension on the 1st of April was mocked as the world's worst April Fool's joke by Ukraine's foreign minister, given Russia's invasion. In the past, other countries such as the US and the UK have also presided over the Security Council while waging war on Iraq, for example. The makeup of the council was put together in the aftermath of World War II, with vetoes for all 5 permanent members. But is it fit for today's world? We'll be discussing this and more in a few moments with our guests. But first, Fintan Monahan reports on the debate over Russia's presidency of the Security Council.
For the next month, Russia will chair the UN Security Council. The Council's presidency rotates every month, and that gives the holder some influence in shaping its agenda. But some members are objecting to Russia chairing a body dedicated to peace and security as it wages war in Ukraine.
Yesterday, the Russian army killed another Ukrainian child, a 5-month-old boy. The parents are wounded. One of the hundreds of artillery attacks that the terrorist state carries out every day. And at the same time, Russia presides over the UN Security Council. It is difficult to imagine anything that proves the complete bankruptcy of such institutions.
The Ukrainians are pushing for Russia to be removed from the council. But even Kiev's allies admit that's effectively impossible.
Unfortunately, Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, and no feasible international legal pathway exists to change that reality. That is what we are living with currently. As unpalatable as it may be to see Russia presiding over the council, the reality is this is a largely ceremonial position.
Russia's presidency has emboldened some critics of the UN. Veto-wielding members like Russia and the United States often prevent the council from acting. But there have also been breakthroughs. The UN successfully brokered a deal in July allowing Ukrainian grain to pass through the Black Sea. UN officials have also been active at Europe's largest nuclear power plant, which has been caught in the crossfire between Russian and Ukrainian forces. But both sides are gearing up for a new offensive in Ukraine. The war has brought big challenges to the UN, and many are questioning what role it can play during the largest scale conflict in Europe since World War II. Fintan Monahan, Al Jazeera.
So let's bring in our guests now. In Moscow, we have Stanislav Mitrakhovich, international relations researcher at the Financial University under the government of the Russian Federation. In Helsinki, Rasmus Hindren, head of international relations at the European Centre of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats. And over in Brussels is Stephen Erlanger, chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. Welcome to all of you. Stanislav, if I could start with you in Moscow. So let's just get this straight. A country in the act of fighting a war that's killed tens of thousands of people is now head of an organization that was set up to promote peace and security. It's absurd, isn't it?
Well, UN was organized to prevent a third world war, a super big war. Everything else is just a question of interpretation. So I think UN played its role in preventing the third world war. Everything else, well, you know, America waged war, Russia waged wars, many other countries waged wars, including countries that are considered to be permanent members of the Security Council and countries that are just part of Security Council not being permanent members. So I wouldn't say it's absurd. It will be absurd to get Russia out of United Nations because this new United Nations will not be recognized by China, possibly by India. So still it is a space for a discussion. It is still a square where we can meet. It was possible to use UN even in the period of Cold War. Why not use it now?
Rasmus, what do you think? Is it right that Russia should head the Security Council while it's prosecuting this war in Ukraine?
Well, I think absurd is one a good way to describe it, because I mean we have a country that has been designated an aggressor state by the UN, and we have a country whose leader is an accused war criminal. So in those terms, it's fair to call the situation absurd.
So in practical terms, what will Russia bring to the table in its role as presiding over the UN Security Council for this time?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, of course, it's mostly a symbolic position, but it's, of course, it has, the presidency has agenda-setting power, it has a narrative power, and I think that's where Russia will try to be most active to bring their version of the narrative to the forefront, to spread disinformation as they did in February 2022 when they last held the presidency.
Okay, we'll explore that line in a little bit. But Stephen, first of all, of course, there is precedent, as I mentioned in the introduction. The United States had chair at the time of its invasion of Iraq. So really, nobody can complain about who takes the chair now.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, these are just the rules. This is life. This is the way the UN works. The UN was set up basically to give special privileges to the big powers that won the Second World War. One can ask quite rightly, are those still the right powers to sit on the Security Council? Should the Security Council still have a veto? Should Germany be part of the Security Council, India, et cetera, But those are reforms. I just think, this is the UN. We've had very odd cases in the past. For instance, we've had the Syrian regime sitting on the UN Human Rights Council, which I find as offensive as almost anything else. So, I'm not terribly upset by it. I know why the Ukrainians are upset by it, and I know why people are making, kind of rhetorical hay out of it. But I do believe the UN exists to have conversations. It does have its rules, and I think it's just the way it is. We can not like it, we can like it, it really doesn't matter. It's going to take a lot to change it, and it won't be changed by tomorrow.
Stephen, can Russia use its chairmanship to its advantage, as Rasmus was just alluding to?
Well, I'm sure it can. It can certainly try. I know it wants to set a debate on arms control, for instance, which it has its own point of view. It has its own narrative, but it may have other debates that it wants. But the fact is, I think it won't change the world's understanding of what's happening inside Ukraine. I mean, there are already some countries in the world, like China, who are embarrassed by it, or also permanent members who keep saying they believe in territorial integrity and yet do not condemn Russia's invasion of sovereign Ukraine. So there's lots of contradictions to go around, it seems to me.
And Stanislav, it certainly enables Russia to present itself as a legitimate world player to its people back at home, Russians back at home.
Well, of course, if Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations, that is much more important than International Criminal Court that, let's say, is not recognized by many other countries, including US and China. Security Council is much more important than, let's say, General Assembly that mostly make just rhetorical declarations and nothing more. So definitely it is important for internal legitimacy of Russian power inside Russia. It is important for external legitimacy. Russia is recognized by China, by India, by many Arabic countries, by global South, I would say, as a legitimate power of the world. And the war in Ukraine doesn't change it. It's necessary to understand and to admit that it will be necessary to have a deal with Russia anyway, even after this military conflict is somehow resolved.
Stanislav, I just wanted to ask you as well what you made of what Dmitry Polyansky said, who's the Russia's deputy permanent representative at the UN, denying that this concept that Russia was becoming a pariah at the United Nations. And he said that I think it is the West that is isolated, but not us, not Russia in the General Assembly. It's going a bit far, isn't it?
Well, I wouldn't say that West is isolated. West is a very important part of the world in itself, and many other countries outside of the West have trade relations and political relations and diplomatic relations and migration relations with the West. So I wouldn't say that West is isolated. But Russia is not isolated as well, and Russia is not a pariah state. You know, just recently, Chinese leader visited Moscow with a 3-day visit. How can you call any country a pariah state when it is visited by a leader of the second superpower in the world? So let's say that Russia and Western countries both have their own narrative. They are not isolated in the world, but they are to a large extent isolated from each other. So it's true to say that Russia is to a large extent is isolated from the West, but not on the global scale. Let's admit it.
Rasmus, I just want to back up a little bit to better understand the role of the Security Council. The permanent members of the Council are the UK, US, France, China and Russia. Tell us more about the establishment of the Security Council, why it was set up and why those nations in particular.
Well, it was obviously in the aftermath of the Second World War, and there were the 5 countries gathered, the most powerful countries, to become the permanent members. Of course, Russia wasn't originally part of that, but pretty soon also then became a part of it. But I mean, as was already explained, there has been an attempt to reform the Security Council almost ever since it was established in the first place, but reform is really difficult. So we're still stuck with this current format, and because basically any change in that system would require that all the permanent members would agree to the reform, which is why we haven't seen that reform happening. Effectively, and in conflicts like this one, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, we see that the Security Council immediately becomes paralyzed because it's a permanent member of the Security Council that is the aggressor nation.
Stephen, there are those who question whether even Russia holds a legitimate seat, should hold a legitimate seat on the UN Security Council, given that when it was established, it was the Soviet Union and not Russia that had that seat.
Well, I mean, Russia is recognized as the legal inheritor of the Soviet Union's seat. So I don't think that's really in question, frankly. And also, it is worth saying, I mean, the United States recognizes Russia as a great power. That's not the issue. And the United States recognizes Russia's position on the Security Council. The question is rather a different one, which is the paralysis that Rasmus just described of a UN Security Council, which has veto power over everything, including anything to do with it. I mean, normally in a judicial system, a party that's involved would recuse itself from a decision, but instead any member of the Security Council can block anything that it actually likes. And frankly, if Russia didn't block something, China might block for it. So it is a kind of paralysis. It's just a kind of moral conundrum, or perhaps it's simply, you know, international relations and international law, to me, have very little to do with one another. I know we want to make it so, but in my experience covering conflict, in general, international law isn't the deciding factor. What's deciding factor is lots of things, including power. You should ask, you know, Mr. Putin why he went into Ukraine. I think he had every understanding that he was breaking international law, breaking the UN Charter. It simply didn't matter to him.
Stanislav, what do you think about this concept of the paralysis that's created by any single member being able to veto any form of resolution? It just means that it's toothless, that there is never any progress.
Yeah. Well, I think it is so by design. It was designed this way to satisfy the demands of the winning powers of the Second World War. United Nations Security Council cannot make a move against United States, against Russia, against France, against Great Britain, and against China. So it is so by design. Let's admit it's better to have it than to have nothing. It is a way to at least to to deal with some differences, to some different political positions. This is a way to prevent the Third World War. And from this perspective, Security Council was more or less successful. As from the point of view of being a global policeman, well, of course, it doesn't work this way, just because they are different countries with different agendas. Probably some people in 90s, in the beginning of the 21st century, they thought that Security Council would be global policeman. But you know, Russia has its own position, China has its own position, and you cannot imagine a kind of a quasi-global government or global policeman. In a way, Security Council exists without support of Russia and China. It will be not working. And what about India? What about Brazil? By the way, it was Russian idea to probably include these countries, and these countries historically had a long history of debates with Russia, how it is possible to include India and Brazil into the Security Council. And I wouldn't say that it will be easier for Western countries to suppress, I don't know, Russian political regime if India and Brazil join Security Council. I suppose it will be even more difficult for the Western world in this case.
Do you think that's the case, Rasmus, that if you broaden the membership, that it's going to create more difficulty and more intractability going forward?
I think the question of the reform is a bit more nuanced. I mean, there is a question of broadening the participation in the Security Council. Then there's another question is what to do with the veto power. Then there's a question of what is the role of the General Assembly, and should that be also increased a little bit? So I think it's a little bit more complicated question. But I mean, it's fair to say that this current setup is not really reflecting the reality of the situation at the moment. But I also think that what Stephen was saying, that normally in these kind of situations, one would expect the country that is involved in the conflict and in fact is the aggressor to recuse itself from those considerations around that conflict. But of course that hasn't happened.
No, and Rasmus, this concept of veto power, was it just an error of judgment at the establishment of the UN Security Council? Is it something that, you know, looking back, the founders, if they were able to, might wish that they'd done differently?
Well, I mean, yes, in a way, yes, and that's why the whole debate around the reform has been going around for so many decades. But of course, it was reflecting the realities of the moment, and yeah, let's just say that the great powers, no matter how we define a great power, they are really reluctant to relinquish any of that power, and this is just a reality we're living with.
All right. We've touched on it briefly, but let's explore more now about the UN Security Council's role, especially in Ukraine. And Stephen, as far as the conflict is concerned, what has the United Nations managed to achieve, first of all?
Well, I think Guterres, who's the Secretary General, has felt kind of on the side. He's been trying to find ways to insert the UN into the conflict, which is difficult for all the reasons that we've just been talking about. But the UN has been very much trying to be an agent for the countries that need Ukrainian grain and Russian fertilizer. So working with Turkey, the United Nations was instrumental in creating a system whereby Ukraine could export some of its grain. I think the UN's International Atomic Energy Agency has been very, very important in trying to raise the world's consciousness, not just, and also the Russian military consciousness of the dangers involved in the war around some of Ukraine's biggest atomic energy plants, originally built, 50 years ago. under the Soviet Union, of course, but they are, Zaporizhia in particular has warfare all around it. It has had electricity cuts. It's been very, very dangerous. And I think Rafael Grossi and his team have done a very, very good job in trying to keep it safe. So I think that's important. And I think we should not underestimate the importance of organizations like UNHCR and the World Food Program and UNICEF in just trying to help the poor who are most affected by this war. They're not combatants, but they are also victims.
And Stanislav, so those are the positives that Stephen has just itemized. In terms of where the UN has failed as far as this conflict is concerned, interested to know what your perspective is on that.
Well, I agree with that. There are parts of UN that are important for everyone. For example, food program is important for everyone. Cultural, social issues are important for everyone. And once again, I want to underline that we are still living. We were able to survive the period of Cold War, and UN played a role there. It was a mediator, a place for discussions, for resolving conflicts. Yes, not all the conflicts were prevented. There were wars all over the world, Vietnam, Korea, in Africa, and many other parts of the world, Afghanistan, but there was no shooting war between Soviet Union and United States of America, between Soviet bloc, Warsaw Pact, and NATO. And this is one of the results that can be called a great success of United Nations organizations. So to a large extent, it was a
what about this
successful part
conflict
of
in
world
particular,
history.
Stanislav?
Probably it could be used later. Particular today? Well, I think this grain deal is what UN can do. A deal about fertilizers. International Atomic Energy Agency is also a very important mediator here. I will not be surprised if, in the end, diplomatic relations between Russia and Ukraine could be restored with the help of UN. Why not? So, well, I still do believe that UN is something important in our world.
Yeah, and Rasmus, the UN certainly failed to broker any kind of peace as of this moment. But I guess when the end of the conflict happens, the UN is going to play a key role in how things progress.
Yeah, it's possible that the UN will play a role there, and to get the overall legitimacy of any deal, it would be important to have the UN involved. I think in practice there might be some smaller groups of countries that might try to act as mediators and go-betweens, and maybe it could evolve from there. But of course, in any of these plans, the most crucial thing is to see what Ukraine is ready and willing to do, and hopefully then a solution could be worked out.
Stephen, do you think the UN Security Council could have played a bigger role in trying to achieve some kind of resolution to the conflict as of now?
Oh, I wish that were true. It might have been true before February 24th of last year, when Russian troops crossed the border. Once that happened, I think we're stuck. But it is possible that the UN could have done more, I think, to try to resolve the conflicts. It's hard to say, because ever since the Maidan in 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, Russia has basically violated the UN Charter and violated Ukrainian sovereignty, which Russia itself had recognized as early as 1991. So, in the end, you can only solve conflicts when two sides want to solve conflicts or when they're exhausted. And I think that's a moment that has not yet come, and probably hadn't come before much after 2014. So I don't really blame the UN for this, but I do think there was a lot of complacency about Ukraine and Russia after 2014, when many, many thousands of people were dying in the Donbass in basically an undeclared war.
And Stanislav, ultimately, the ball is in President Putin's court, isn't it, to find resolution to this conflict?
Well, I think Putin is one of the most important players in the world now, including Ukrainian crisis, but he is not alone here. I think he waits for some moves from the Western world as well. He wants some kind of peace negotiations that can end this military conflict, but in a situation when Russia can say that it got something, for example, it got this land corridor to Crimea secured, I think it could be enough for Putin to explain to his own population that he was successful, but it is necessary to recognize it from the Western world as well. If, let's say, Mr. Biden said that he is ready for this kind of deal, in this case, I think conflict could end.
Rasmus, finally, if we just come to you in terms of, we've been talking about the reformation of the UN Security Council. Certainly President Biden has said that they support increasing the number of both permanent and non-permanent representatives of the Council. But as we've discussed, actually making that happen is difficult. Can you say, I mean, if we spin forward, say, 10 years, in a decade's time, is it going to look as it does now? Because as time goes on, it looks more and more archaic.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's one can't be too optimistic at this point. In the longer term, we don't know. Certainly, there might be some new avenues opening for actually making the reform happen. But I think right now is really not the time even to be focusing too much on that reform. There are other pressing matters at hand. But if I could just go back also to the previous points made and whether the UN failed to prevent the invasion. I mean, I wouldn't blame the UN, but it was in a way unfortunate that Russia had the rotating presidency of the Security Council a year ago, back in February 22, and it used that opportunity to talk about its peaceful intentions, which basically served to erode the support for the other countries to have a coalition to prevent that invasion. So it was an unfortunate timing in that sense, and allowed a possibility for Russia to spread that kind of mis or disinformation.
Rasmus, appreciate that. We're going to have to leave it there. In fact, to all our guests, thank you very much indeed. To Stanislav Mitrakhovich, to Rasmus Hindren, and to Stephen Erlanger. Thanks for joining us. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, just go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the whole team here, it's goodbye for now.